Foreign aid is defined as money, food, or other resources given or lent by one country to another. Hello, my name is Jordan Barrocas, and foreign aid is strange and complex. The many bits and pieces fit together to make a massive change or none on the other side of the world, good or bad, with an interestingly small amount of oversight usually. This is also not to discredit foreign aid. When done right, it does good, but very often is missing key components to its success. And I am merely informing you on what small bits of information I know about the subject, so you may make informed choices about aid, or be able to sound smart at some point. There are two images I see when I think of foreign aid. One is the stock image of a nameless man or woman in vague aid organization, first aid, Peace Corps, etc., assisting a small village or town, maybe advising a local leader, or just taking in the situation, but still helping and able to provide what these people who ask for help need. And the second image is from Black Hawk Down. At the beginning of the movie, you see a Red Cross food distribution center, and people flock for the food. An armed militia arrives, gunning down civilians, and claims the food. All the while, a helicopter with Army Rangers flies overhead. As civilians are killed, they request permission to engage. It is denied, because they're not taking fire and return to base. Why can we deliver food and aid to these places and have no way to ensure it reach hungry mouths? Even worse, how can we have aid organizations that act independently from most supervision and send aid to places in need only to help continue an oppressive regime without oversight? But on the flip side, if the oversight used makes the money go to a company owned by the president's family, then it's not doing much anyway. And there have been times in history when government aid was used to support an oppressive regime to stop the spread of certain things, such as the theology supported in Iran, communism throughout history, and as said by History.com in 1951, aid was given to Yugoslavia, a bit of a Cold War wildcard, but overall did not support communism. And it does not need to outright support any system. It can support ideas or broad groups, such as governments that do not support your government, the ideals of democracy. An example of such aid, according to United States Agency for International Development, otherwise known as USAID, is in Afghanistan to combat terrorism. Over $4.7 billion was given, and etc. The true concept of foreign aid on a huge scale started with the Marshall Project, which, as stated by USAID, was started after World War II to give incentive for countries to stop joining the USSR, with developmental loans, military aid, food, and medicine, created with an act known as the Truman Doctrine. It wasn't so much a choice to help these countries as a strategic necessity to help stop the spread of communism. And this was a large and first introduction to foreign aid to America. Although foreign aid continued and grew over the Cold War in the general attempt to sway people towards a free market and democracy, another organization was also formed during this time as a sort of international entity for rebuilding everywhere, the World Bank, which would later become the International Monetary Fund. The mainstream foreign aid we know now started, as stated by the Washington Post, in Biafra in the late 1960s, a small oil-rich area that seceded from Nigeria and was being blockaded. It was the first televised instance of a humanitarian crisis, children starving in the streets and other acts of desperate people. It sparked the biggest non-military airlift the world had ever seen, and gave people the idea that there are many crises occurring all over the underdeveloped world, and if they band together with their communities, schools, work, and etc., they could change the world. The idea was wholly supported by the U.S. government, and why shouldn't it have been? The incident provided proof that everyday people, realizing some are worse off, could help. They formed charities, organized aid initiatives, and in turn, the government provided tax breaks and subsidies. And just like that, balance occurred. Poverty and hunger were eradicated, and everyone played Monopoly together, no matter what language they spoke or where they were from. But not really. The idea of sending over large amounts of goods and money as a non-government organization was good, in the sense that they would not have to deal with the bureaucracy and diplomatic back channels. But those were there for a reason, to ensure that the aid was given in a way so it could arrive at the place it was sent, be given to who it was needed, and overall be used most effectively most of the time. But without the organized systems and administrations to keep the resources in check, they were sent over as more of a Trojan horse than anything. The aid recipients accepted an easy gift, and in reality led a potentially dangerous force into their rural and impoverished areas, increased corruption, devastating inflation, and creation of dependency cycles. Corruption is easy to explain. People want money and things, and when they see no one looking, will take it. When trying to combat corruption, there is often large backlash about lack of oversight, unless you are the EU, in which case you have so much paperwork you might as well cover your boxes full of medicine and red tape, which also causes anger, because it makes it relatively obnoxious to work with the EU. But another piece of information, as stated by Professor Dr. Laurel Heidemann at Northern Illinois University, is that there's a relatively hostile attitude towards non-government organizations, NGOs, around the world, which impacts how they can help and freedoms given. Inflation is affected by the fact you are giving money to a country who is already struggling. When this happens, if proper oversight is not present, they may choose to buy from local producers of goods, which will either cause more employment, but if you already have high employment, it causes inflation. An example, presented by USAID, is the Food for Peace program, where the U.S. sends meat and dairy to countries who cannot feed their people. But if money is sent instead of food, and food is bought from local farms, then inflation would likely occur. Independency cycles occur often. A drought happens, so food is sent, but it's too much food and lasts for much longer than expected, even after the drought is over. Then, when farmers go to sell their crops, they find there is no market because everyone has food. So farmers go out of business, and more food aid is needed for next year when there are no farmers locally growing crops. This problem arose in 1957, when President Eisenhower gave a wheat surplus to India during a food shortage. In the end, it worsened the problem considerably, and still millions died of starvation. Also, with most aid packages from other governments come a sort of loan or agreement upon money being paid or some kind of resource being available for later use. Tons of debt. Usually with foreign aid, there is a loan embedded in the package, and the fact that receiving aid creates a cycle in which more aid is necessary until debt gets to the point of national crash. There are also many types of aid which we call tied. If the U.S. gives money to Malawi, they will expect Malawi to give goods to buy goods from the U.S. with that money. But this can have bad effects. Sometimes only certain products are allowed to be bought, such as only Jeeps for cars, with money given, which, if the country is on the other side of the world, could cause lots of difficulty and expenses. If you need specialized parts to repair the Jeeps, it becomes more of a white elephant than anything, as well as the dangers of when a large loan is given. Will the recipient's country's economy grow fast enough to pay back the interest rates? And if the interest rate is higher than the inflation rate? Another issue is the kinds of aid given. Something that has risen dramatically in recent years is an idea expressed very well in a book called The Bright Continent. Is us giving our trash to people in need, sometimes literally. In America, more in the sense of old clothes and furniture and actual trash. But there are many ways of helping while not helping. Take, for example, the shoe company Tom's, who donate a pair of shoes to someone in need for every pair sold. The problem isn't that there are shoeless people all over Africa, but they need steady work. If they put that money instead towards providing jobs and steady pay, then it would help in unimaginable ways. Shoes are not in short supply. The areas being sent shoes are famous for their textiles and have abundant rubber. Just steady pay, and the shoes tend not to do much. Imagine if the roles were reversed. Would you wear the shoes of pity? The problem, as with most problems, is the radicals. When there is little or no aid given, or when there is so much that people become dependent. As Johns Hopkins professor Deborah Brodingham has demonstrated, aid flows are negatively related to government function. For every dollar of foreign assistance donated to developing states, government spending drops by 43 cents. The main problem is that aid is given at the top, not the bottom. Farms and small economies do not get the money to grow farms or start local businesses. They have discovered that agriculture is one of the key ways to end hunger and poverty. And people lose their jobs because they're not required anymore. Some villages don't even dig their own wells anymore because they know at some point an organization will come along and do it for them. And some governments get rid of the functional part of their government to the point where they are just catering to foreign powers, such as in Niger, where they arrested protesters to Western military powers to help control radicalist groups, so they may keep receiving aid and have to spend as little as possible. This also lowers taxes, decreasing the general effectiveness of the government, making it harder to oversee and distribute effectively. That was a lot of bad, but here's the good. We can and are doing foreign aid better, with success being achieved throughout the world. The Peace Corps is a very effective organization that acts not only as an aid and local support, but as an ambassador to America for people all over the world. Some countries, like Rwanda and Ethiopia, have made dramatic progress in improving the health of its poorest families in the past 3 decades. The number of children who die each year has dropped from 12 million to less than 6 million people worldwide, as said by NPR. And information provided by Dr. Mitchell Bard is Israel, a foreign aid success story, wave after wave of disaster, massive Arab offensive, having to import all raw materials, 450% inflation per year, 17% budget deficit, and the burden of providing thousands of destitute immigrants social services. Then, a large $1.5 billion aid package was delivered by Congress, with many conditions, on the aid package and oversight, and the nation has recovered and is now one of the fastest growing economies in the world. But what are some ways to do it better? We should have aid provided by organizations, but they stay in the region the aid is given, to enforce, make sure the aid is received, and the organization sees the repercussions of their actions, keep a lookout for corruption, and other negative effects. In a way, there are already 3 organizations like this: the Peace Corps, the UN Peacekeepers, and the World Bank, now known as the International Monetary Fund, which was started after World War II, to help encourage growth and monitor places around the world, fiscally and otherwise. They provide research grants, developmental loans, monitored small-scale microfinance, and distribution of knowledge, which encompasses access to the internet, libraries, and communications with other places nearby. As presented by the UN, R2P is a good example of this. The Responsibility to Protect Act was created by the UN in 2001, most notably created after systematic genocides and human rights violations committed in Rwanda and the Balkan states, so that the Human Rights Charter could be upheld. An act that said if a government had the inability or lacked the will to protect its people, that other nations could intervene, was utilized often during the early 2000s. An example of such is Myanmar. The Rohingya people are a Muslim minority. They are being killed by the government in the name of security because of terrorist threats. The government believes they will commit terrorist acts due to protest, which are caused by mistreatment by the government, which shows the difficulty of when atrocities are being committed knowingly by a government. They can justify their actions or make cycles of action, where they cause and have reason to kill others. Another example of R2P involvement is in Libya in 2011. When the government was openly attacking civilians, R2P was called into effect. Much international intervention of other nations occurred, backing rebels who overthrew the dictator at the time, and the rebuilding process began. But currently, the state in Libya is still somewhat of an active war zone. Even though there is an internationally recognized government, rebels backed by other nations continue to fight, which shows where most of the time R2P fails, the rebuilding process. Many countries, the US in particular, don't know how to intervene properly or rebuild a stable government. Because once you intervene, you make a commitment to stay and rebuild, which is very expensive and not always successful. The 2 I believe that can make the most difference are the UN Peacekeepers and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. Both have problems currently, but they both have very crucial roles. The Peacekeepers provide the on-the-ground support and security of a standing army and police force, as well as teams of engineers and economic developers. They help local growth and general stabilization for areas around the world. They could always use more money and more manpower. And the IMF helps with entire government reconstruction, as well as large public works projects and infrastructure overhauls. It can be unreliable. Interest rates float around as currency values shift, which can cause vast debt or even budget deficits. Things that help make aid more effective. Having the consent of the local government, most of the time. You have a representative visit. Keep them in the loop of changes. Prevent friction. But the local government's attitude will change depending on some factors. Who gets a cut of what? Who is giving aid? And the attitude of the aid given. Trying to send aid that does not outcompete local businesses. Try not to send free things unless absolutely necessary. And when things such as food or clothing are sent, make sure it is rationed out accordingly and not sent in bulk, but is carefully injected into regions that need it. And make organizations abide by a strict code, almost on tier with the UN and international intervention groups, such as military forces and Peace Corps, as well as peacekeepers. And possibly find an alternative way to provide support in force and make sure aid can and is distributed well. And ways to make aid produce positive economic growth, such as the purchase of productive machinery, microfinance, roads, and other forms of infrastructure. If they build a soccer stadium, it will not create much growth, which raises the importance of oversight, and providing an open market for any nation into the U.S. will almost always have good outcomes. But Professor Patrick Conway at UNC spoke on the point of creating a free market isn't counted as foreign aid. It certainly helps, but all of aid is an interconnected web. It requires many bases to be covered, such as local growth, family planning, youth employment, digital inclusion, and a free press, as well as many others. All things that can help, and little solutions create big solutions, a relatively simple sentiment often overlooked. There are better options for aid, but they also have deep-rooted problems and foundational weaknesses that allow it to be misused or not have the desired effect. For microfinance, it was found that microloans only helped enrich the people who work at the companies, as they secretly charged 195% interest on their loans, as well as many microfinance meltdowns marked by client debt, default, and withdrawal, as well as closing of microfinance in the area, as seen in Morocco, Nicaragua, Bolivia, and Pakistan. The most devastating event like this occurred in India and Andhra Pradesh in late 2010, where the poor took out more microloans to pay off the microloans from before. microfinance support in the region collapsed. The downside of distribution of knowledge and communications, such as internet, cell service, libraries, is that often it is abused, monitored, monetized, and taxed by the government, only used by the military or certain classes, or resold to other nations. Or, when this knowledge arrives, it overshadows or outright destroys indigenous sustainable farming practices, building techniques, and medical knowledge. It also has the potential to destroy other cultural beliefs and can create something of a monoculture, with values from different places and ideas never used before. Most of what I have learned from looking into this issue is the complexity of it. There's no silver bullet. It will take a little bit of each to make a solution. And the solution will take time, energy, and most importantly, people who really believe in it. Money is nice too, but it only goes as far as the people giving it help it go. I'm not saying this to dissuade you from giving aid, but to give you more information so you can make an educated decision and you can understand why there's still problems, and with why all we have given, we must give more.